When aging widower Leonard Russo stumbled upon an enigmatic flyer promising eternal enlightenment, he was drawn in by its allure. He cashed out his entire pension to join the mysterious cult known as the Circle of Aeternum. What followed was a descent into eerie rituals, cryptic prophecies, and devastating consequences that no one saw coming. But as Leonard uncovered the group's sinister secrets, he realized too late that the price for enlightenment was far more than his life savings. Leonard Russo's life had dwindled into monotony. Days bled into one another, a cycle of silence punctuated only by the creaking of his worn-out recliner and the occasional chime of the clock in his dimly lit living room. His wife, Eleanor, had passed 3 years earlier, leaving behind a void so vast that even the walls of their once vibrant home seemed to mourn her absence. Leonard had tried to fill his days with hobbies, gardening, crossword puzzles, even a brief stint at a senior yoga class, but nothing stuck. One rainy evening, as Leonard sipped lukewarm tea and stared out the window at the falling rain, a peculiar sight caught his attention. A man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat was walking briskly down the street, slipping flyers into mailboxes. He paused in front of Leonard's house, glanced around, and placed a single gold-embossed flyer on the doorstep. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, the man vanished into the downpour. Curiosity piqued, Leonard shuffled to the door, the hinges groaning in protest as he opened it. He picked up the flyer and squinted at the ornate script. The Circle of Aeternum. Unlock the secrets of eternal enlightenment. Free seminar this weekend. Beneath the bold letters was an address for a nearby conference hall. Leonard's first instinct was to dismiss it as some sort of scam. Yet, as he stared at the flyer, something stirred within him. A yearning, a desperate hope for something more than the hollow existence he'd been enduring. He placed the flyer on the kitchen counter and spent the rest of the evening trying to ignore its pull. By the next morning, Leonard found himself unable to stop thinking about it. He knew it was foolish, but a voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, this could be the answer to the question that had plagued him since Eleanor's death. What's the point of it all? When Saturday arrived, Leonard dressed in his best shirt and slacks, combed his thinning gray hair, and made his way to the address on the flyer. The conference hall was surprisingly crowded. Dozens of people, young and old, mingled in the lobby, all clutching identical flyers. A cheerful woman in a white uniform greeted Leonard and handed him a name tag. "Welcome, Mr. Russo. You're about to embark on a life-changing journey." The seminar began with a man named Elias Verone taking the stage. Elias was magnetic, his voice rich and commanding, his presence both calming and electrifying. He spoke of life's hardships, the emptiness many felt, and the possibility of transcending pain and mortality. The Circle of Aeternum, he declared, offers not just enlightenment, but a chance to be part of something greater than yourself, a family, a purpose. Leonard was captivated. The words resonated deeply, striking chords of longing and regret that he hadn't realized were there. The testimonials from members were equally moving. One woman tearfully recounted how she'd found peace after years of despair. A young man claimed to have turned his life around after joining. They all spoke of a sense of belonging Leonard hadn't felt in years. At the end of the seminar, Elias invited those who were ready to commit to a higher level of membership, a chance to fully integrate into the circle and unlock its deepest truths. The cost was steep, but Leonard barely hesitated. He cashed out his pension the following week and signed the contract. The onboarding process was swift. Leonard was given a set of white robes, a book of teachings, and a schedule of activities at the circle's headquarters, a sprawling estate deep in the woods. When he arrived for his first meeting, he was struck by the sheer beauty of the place. The estate was surrounded by towering pines, its grounds meticulously landscaped. A serene pond reflected the sky like a mirror, and the main building, a grand mansion with towering columns, exuded an air of timeless elegance. Inside, the atmosphere was equally mesmerizing. Soft, ambient music played in the background as members greeted Leonard with warm smiles and gentle handshakes. Elias himself welcomed Leonard personally, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've made the right choice," he said, his eyes glinting with sincerity. Or so it seemed. The first few weeks were idyllic. Leonard attended workshops, meditated by the pond, and participated in group discussions that left him feeling more connected than he had in years. He even began to see subtle improvements in his health. His chronic joint pain seemed to fade, and he felt a renewed energy coursing through him. But beneath the surface of this paradise, cracks began to show. Leonard noticed that some members seemed anxious, their smiles faltering when they thought no one was looking. Whispers of the ascension echoed through the halls, but when Leonard asked about it, he was met with vague responses and deflections. One night, as he wandered the mansion's dimly lit corridors, he overheard a heated argument between two members. "It's not what we signed up for," one hissed. "But we can't leave," the other replied in a trembling voice. Leonard's unease grew, but he pushed it aside, unwilling to believe that the haven he'd found could harbor darkness. It wasn't until he stumbled upon a locked door in the basement, its frame etched with strange symbols, that he began to truly question what he'd gotten himself into. The flyer had promised enlightenment, but at what cost? Leonard's growing unease about the Circle of Aeternum began to fester in the weeks following his discovery of the locked basement door. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the symbols etched into the wood were part of some obscure decorative style, or the door simply led to a storage area. But the whispers he'd overheard that night stuck with him, like a splinter lodged in the back of his mind. "We can't leave," the voice had trembled. What could it possibly mean? Determined to put his suspicions to rest, Leonard began to observe the group more closely. During the morning meditations by the pond, he noticed that not everyone seemed as serene as they pretended to be. Some members had dark circles under their eyes, their gazes darting nervously as if they were being watched. Others whispered in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. Leonard's attempts to approach these individuals were met with evasive smiles and quick changes of subject. One day, Leonard worked up the courage to confront a man named Darrell, one of the older members who had been at the circle longer than most. Darrell was a wiry man with a weathered face, and he spent most of his time tending to the gardens. "Darrell," Leonard began hesitantly as they planted tulips together, "what do you know about the ascension?" Darrell froze, his hands tightening around the trowel. His expression, once amiable, turned icy. "It's not something we talk about," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you should be careful, Leonard. Asking too many questions can get you into trouble here." Before Leonard could press further, Darrell stood abruptly and walked away, leaving him alone among the flower beds. That night, Leonard found himself unable to sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying Darrell's words in his mind. What was the ascension? And why did the mere mention of it seem to strike fear into the hearts of the members? Frustrated and restless, Leonard decided to take a walk to clear his head. The mansion was eerily quiet at night, the only sounds being the creak of the wooden floors beneath Leonard's slippers and the faint rustle of leaves outside. Guided by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows, Leonard wandered aimlessly until he found himself standing in front of the basement door. He hadn't planned to come here, but now that he was, he felt a strange compulsion to investigate. The door was locked, as it had been before, but Leonard noticed something he hadn't seen earlier, a faint line of light leaking out from beneath the frame. Someone was down there. His heart pounding, Leonard pressed his ear to the door and listened. At first, he heard nothing but the faint hum of distant voices. Then, a chilling sound reached his ears, a low, guttural chanting in a language he didn't recognize. It was rhythmic and haunting, like a melody born from nightmares. Leonard took a step back, his instinct screaming at him to leave. But before he could turn away, the chanting abruptly stopped, and the light beneath the door went out. Panic surged through him as he realized whoever had been on the other side might now be coming out. He darted into the nearest corridor, pressing himself against the wall and holding his breath. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped out into the hallway. It was Elias Veroni. The cult leader's face was eerily calm, but his eyes burned with an intensity that sent shivers down Leonard's spine. Elias stood in the hallway for a moment, as if sensing he was not alone, before walking away with slow, deliberate steps. Leonard remained frozen until the sound of Elias's footsteps faded into silence. The encounter left Leonard shaken. It was no longer just paranoia or conjecture. There was something deeply sinister happening within the Circle of Aeternum, and Elias was at the heart of it. But Leonard didn't know who to trust. Daryl's warning echoed in his mind. Asking too many questions can get you into trouble here. Despite his fear, Leonard couldn't bring himself to leave. Part of him wanted to believe there was still some good in the circle, that perhaps he was misunderstanding the situation. Another part of him was simply too stubborn to admit he'd made a mistake. He had given up everything for this. The money he had saved for decades, the chance to leave a legacy for his daughter, Mira. He couldn't let it all be for nothing. The next day, Leonard decided to tread carefully. He participated in the usual activities, group discussions, meditation, and lessons on the circle's teachings, but his mind was elsewhere. He began to notice details he had overlooked before, the way certain members seemed to avoid Elias's gaze, the way the staff moved through the mansion like shadows, their presence almost imperceptible. The illusion of tranquility was starting to crumble. As days turned into weeks, Leonard's anxiety grew. The whispers of ascension became more frequent, and the members' behavior more erratic. One evening, during a communal dinner, Leonard overheard a young woman named Cora speaking in hushed tones to another member. "It's happening soon," she said, her voice trembling. "They've started the preparations." That night, Leonard resolved to find out the truth, no matter the cost. He waited until the mansion was quiet and crept back to the basement door. This time, he came prepared. Using a small screwdriver he had taken from the maintenance closet, Leonard managed to jimmy the lock open. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. As Leonard descended, the air grew colder, and the faint smell of decay wafted up to meet him. The basement was vast, its walls lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, ancient-looking tomes, jars of unidentifiable substances, and statues depicting grotesque, otherworldly figures. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained dark with what Leonard could only hope wasn't blood. Before he could fully process what he was seeing, a voice spoke behind him. "I was hoping you'd find your way down here, Leonard." He spun around to find Elias standing at the top of the staircase, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You've been asking questions," Elias continued, his tone calm but menacing. "It's time you learned the answers." Leonard's pulse quickened as Elias descended the staircase, his shadow stretching ominously against the dimly lit walls. The leader's calm demeanor made the air feel heavier, suffocating, as though the room itself had shrunk. Leonard backed away instinctively, his heels brushing against the edge of the stone altar in the center of the room. There was no escape. "You're frightened," Elias said, his tone almost soothing, like a predator calming its prey. "That's natural. You've seen glimpses of our truth, but you don't yet understand. Let me help you." "I don't want your help," Leonard replied, his voice shaky but defiant. "I want answers. What is this place? What are you doing here?" Elias's lips curled into a faint smile. "This," he said, gesturing to the artifacts lining the walls, "is the heart of the circle. These objects hold power, fragments of knowledge passed down through centuries. But the real power, Leonard, lies in what we're preparing for. The ascension." Leonard felt his stomach churn. What does that mean? Why are people afraid of it? Elias's gaze hardened, his tone losing its warmth. "Fear is the byproduct of ignorance. The ascension is not to be feared. It is to be revered. It is a merging, a communion with something far greater than ourselves, something eternal. The words sent a shiver down Leonard's spine. Communion? With what? Instead of answering, Elias stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Leonard's. You've already sacrificed so much to be here. Your money, your old life. Why stop now? Why not see it through? Leonard clenched his fists. Because I didn't sign up for this. I came here for peace, for meaning, not for whatever this is. He gestured to the grotesque statues and the blood-stained altar. This isn't enlightenment, it's madness. Elias's expression darkened, and for the first time, Leonard saw a flicker of anger beneath the cult leader's composed facade. You're clinging to the lies of the world you left behind. But that world failed you, didn't it? It took your wife, your joy, your purpose. The circle offers you a chance to rise above that pain, to transcend. Leonard shook his head. Not like this. Elias sighed as though disappointed. You're not ready to understand, Leonard, but you will be. Everyone resists at first, but the truth is undeniable. It's only a matter of time. He turned and began ascending the staircase, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Go back to your room. Rest. You'll need your strength for what's to come. For a moment, Leonard considered running after him, demanding more answers, but the weight of the encounter had drained him. His legs felt like lead, and his thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind of fear and confusion. Slowly, he made his way back up the stairs, every creak of the wooden steps amplifying the silence that had fallen over the mansion. In the days that followed, Leonard struggled to act as though nothing had changed. He continued to participate in group activities, smiling and nodding when necessary, but his mind was consumed by what he had seen and heard. The other members seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the darkness lurking beneath their feet. The whispers about the ascension grew louder, more frequent, and Leonard began to notice subtle changes in the group's dynamics. One evening, Leonard found Cora alone in the garden, her hands trembling as she tended to a row of lavender bushes. He approached cautiously, keeping his voice low. Cora, I need to talk to you. She glanced up, her eyes wide with fear. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. If they see us talking— I don't care, Leonard interrupted. I need to know what's happening. What is the ascension? What are they preparing for? Cora hesitated, glancing around to ensure they were alone. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. The ascension is a ritual, a sacrifice. They say it's meant to bring us closer to something, but no one who's been chosen ever comes back. Leonard felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Chosen? What do you mean? They pick someone, Cora said, her voice breaking. Someone from the group. It's supposed to be an honor, but it's not. She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting behind Leonard. He turned to see two staff members standing at the edge of the garden, their expressions unreadable. Without a word, they gestured for Cora to follow them. She cast Leonard a desperate look before obeying, leaving him alone among the lavender. That night, Leonard's fear turned to resolve. He couldn't stand by and watch whatever horrifying ritual the circle was planning unfold. He had to find a way to stop it, to escape, if necessary. But as he packed a small bag with essentials, he realized how little he knew about the outside world. He had no money, no car, and the mansion was miles from the nearest town. The circle had isolated him completely, and any attempt to leave would be fraught with danger. Reaching the front door, Leonard paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. But before he could turn the handle, a voice behind him froze him in place. Going somewhere, Leonard? He turned slowly to see Elias standing at the end of the hallway, flanked by two staff members. The faint smile on his face sent a chill down Leonard's spine. You didn't think it would be that easy, did you? Elias asked, his tone dripping with menace. Leonard's grip tightened on his bag. "I'm leaving. You can't stop me." Elias chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Oh, Leonard, you still don't understand. You're not a guest here. You're part of the circle now, and no one leaves the circle." Leonard's breath hitched as Elias's words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The two staff members flanked Elias, their expressions devoid of humanity, as if they were extensions of his will rather than people with lives of their own. Leonard's grip on his bag tightened, his knuckles turning white. "You can't keep me here," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Elias took a slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Leonard," he said softly, almost mockingly, "you've misunderstood the nature of your commitment. The circle isn't a place you simply visit. It's a calling, a destiny. You're not just here. You belong here." Leonard shook his head, retreating until his back met the cold surface of the front door. "This isn't destiny. This is a prison," he said through gritted teeth. The cult leader's calm demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing something darker, something feral. "Do you think the life you left behind was freedom?" Elias snapped, his voice rising. "You were a hollow shell of a man, drowning in grief, waiting to die. The circle gave you purpose. It gave you a chance to matter, and yet you dare reject it." Leonard stood frozen, torn between fear and anger. For a fleeting moment he considered charging past them, but the calculating look in Elias's eyes told him it would be futile. The staff members were blocking every possible escape route, and even if he managed to evade them, where would he go? The forest surrounding the mansion was vast and unrelenting. Elias seemed to sense his hesitation and smiled, the feral glint in his eyes softening into something almost pitying. "You won't leave tonight, Leonard. But soon you'll come to see that the ascension is the path you've been searching for. It will cleanse you of the pain that haunts you. It will make you whole." The cult leader gestured to the staff members who stepped forward, their hands outstretched. "Take him back to his quarters. He needs time to reflect." Leonard resisted, pulling away as they grabbed him, but their grip was ironclad. "Let go of me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. But no one came to his aid. No one even peeked out from their rooms. The mansion might as well have been abandoned, save for the men dragging him down the corridor. When they reached his quarters, the staff members shoved him inside without a word and locked the door behind him. Leonard stumbled, catching himself against the edge of the bed. The silence that followed was deafening. He sank onto the mattress, his head in his hands. The reality of his situation pressed down on him like a crushing weight. He was trapped. Every attempt to escape, every effort to find answers seemed to tighten the circle's grip on him, and yet a spark of defiance remained. As the hours crawled by, Leonard's mind raced. He thought of the basement, the altar, the strange artifacts lining the shelves. He thought of Cora's trembling voice as she spoke of sacrifices. The word ascension replayed in his mind, a haunting refrain. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let himself become a part of it. The next morning, Leonard was summoned to a meeting with Elias. Two staff members escorted him to a sunlit room filled with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest. Elias stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Good morning, Leonard," Elias said without turning around. His voice was calm, measured. "I hope you've had time to reflect on our conversation last night." Leonard crossed his arms, refusing to sit. "I'm not here to reflect. I'm here for answers." Elias chuckled softly, finally turning to face him. "You're nothing if not persistent. Very well. Ask your questions." Leonard took a deep breath. "What is the ascension? And why do people disappear after they're chosen?" Elias's smile faded, replaced by a look of grave seriousness. "The ascension is the ultimate act of devotion. It is a bridge between our world and the eternal. Those who are chosen become part of something greater than themselves." Their physical forms may fade, but their essence lives on, intertwined with the divine. Leonard's stomach turned. "You're talking about killing people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elias's eyes narrowed. "Do not reduce it to something so crude. The chosen ones transcend mortality. They achieve enlightenment in its purest form. It is an honor." "An honor?" Leonard snapped. "You're sacrificing people to some thing. That's not enlightenment. That's insanity." Elias's calm facade shattered. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You speak of insanity, Leonard, yet you cling to a life that brought you nothing but pain. Do you think your wife would want this for you? To squander your chance at peace?" Leonard's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare bring her into this." The cult leader smirked, stepping back. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But the circle has a way of breaking even the strongest wills. You'll see." The meeting ended abruptly, and Leonard was escorted back to his room. The conversation left him more determined than ever to escape, but it also filled him with dread. Elias was right about one thing. The circle had a way of wearing people down. That night, as Leonard lay in the dark, a plan began to take shape. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. Staying meant certain death, or worse. If he was going to escape, he needed to act soon, before the circle chose him as their next honored sacrifice. The night Leonard chose to act was shrouded in a thick fog, as if the world itself was conspiring to obscure his path. The oppressive silence of the mansion pressed on him as he moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors. He had spent days studying the routines of the staff, noting the gaps in their patrols and the few moments when the hallways were truly empty. He knew this was his only chance. His heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the small bag he had packed: water, a flashlight, and a letter he had hastily scrawled for Mira. He didn't know if he would survive, but if he didn't, he wanted his daughter to know that he had tried. The plan was simple: make it to the front gate, find a path through the forest, and keep moving until he reached a town or road. But simplicity did not mean safety. Leonard had seen enough to know that the circle would not let him go easily. As he descended the grand staircase, he heard distant voices echoing from the dining hall. The members were gathered for the evening meal, their laughter and conversation masking the dark undercurrents that ran beneath their words. It struck Leonard how normal they seemed, as if they were completely unaware, or willfully ignorant, of the horrors they were complicit in. The main door loomed ahead, its brass handle gleaming in the faint light. Leonard reached for it, his fingers trembling, when a sudden sound froze him in place. Footsteps. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the shadows for the source. A figure emerged from the darkness, a woman in a white robe, her face partially obscured by the hood. For a moment, Leonard thought she might raise the alarm, but instead she held a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. "Cora?" Leonard whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded, stepping closer. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Leonard hesitated, unsure if she was friend or foe. "I have to. I can't stay here. Not after everything I've seen." Cora glanced over her shoulder, her movements tense and jittery. "You're not the first to try," she said. "Most don't make it." "Why are you telling me this?" Leonard asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Because I want you to make it," she replied, her voice trembling. "You were right. This place. It's evil. I've been too scared to leave, but if you can get out, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." Leonard studied her face, searching for deceit, but all he saw was fear. "Do you know a way out?" he asked. She nodded. "The main gate is heavily guarded, but there's a service entrance on the east side. It's rarely used and the lock is weak. If you're quick, you can get through before they notice." Leonard's grip tightened on his bag. "Why are you helping me?" Cora's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because if you don't escape, they'll choose you next. I can't let that happen." A surge of gratitude and determination washed over Leonard. "Thank you," he said. Cora stepped back, her expression conflicted. "Go, before someone sees us." Leonard didn't need to be told twice. He adjusted his bag and made his way toward the east wing, moving as quickly and quietly as his aging body would allow. The mansion seemed to stretch endlessly, its labyrinthine halls threatening to disorient him at every turn. When he finally reached the service entrance, he found the lock just as Cora had described, old and rusted, its mechanism barely functional. He fumbled with the screwdriver he had brought, his hands shaking as he worked to pry it open. Every second felt like an eternity, the fear of discovery gnawing at his resolve. At last, the lock gave way with a soft click. Leonard pushed the door open and stepped into the cool night air. The forest loomed before him, its trees standing like silent sentinels. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey ahead. The first few steps were the hardest. The forest was dense, its undergrowth thick and unforgiving. Branches clawed at his clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to trip him with every step. But Leonard pressed on, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Behind him, the mansion's lights seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, a reminder of the danger he was leaving behind. He didn't dare look back. Minutes turned into hours as Leonard pushed deeper into the woods. The sounds of the forest surrounded him, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, but every time he stopped to listen, there was only silence. As exhaustion set in, Leonard stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed against a tree. He took a sip of water, his hands trembling from fatigue and adrenaline. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. But the reprieve was short-lived. A low, guttural sound echoed through the trees, a growl that sent a chill down Leonard's spine. He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight darting across the clearing. The beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness, their amber glow unblinking and menacing. Panic surged through him as the growl grew louder, closer. Leonard turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest seemed to close in around him, its branches tearing at his skin as he pushed forward. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder, footsteps, heavy and relentless, crashing through the undergrowth. He didn't know how far he ran or how long he could keep going. All he knew was that stopping meant death. Just when his legs threatened to give out, Leonard burst through the trees and onto a dirt road. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The growling had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent once more. In the distance, a pair of headlights appeared, growing brighter as they approached. A car. Leonard staggered to his feet, waving his arms desperately. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, rolled down the window. "Are you okay, sir?" the man asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Leonard nodded, though tears streamed down his face. "Please," he choked out, "just get me away from here." The man opened the passenger door, and Leonard climbed in, his body trembling with relief. As the car pulled away, Leonard cast one last glance at the forest. In the distance, the lights of the mansion flickered like dying embers, a haunting reminder of what he had escaped. But he knew it wasn't over. The Circle wouldn't let him go so easily. Leonard's escape from the Circle of Aeternum should have been a victory, but the days that followed were anything but triumphant. The man who had picked him up on the dirt road dropped him off at a police station in the nearest town, but Leonard struggled to explain what had happened. The Circle's power wasn't just in its rituals or its leader, it was in its ability to vanish without a trace. When the local authorities drove out to the forest, they found nothing. No mansion, no lights, not even the service entrance Leonard had used to escape. It was as if the entire place had never existed. The officers exchanged skeptical glances as Leonard pleaded with them to keep searching, but their patience quickly wore thin. "You've been through an ordeal," one officer said, his tone patronizing. "Maybe you should see a doctor, get some rest." Frustrated and defeated, Leonard left the station. He wandered the streets of the unfamiliar town, clutching the letter he had written to Mira. She was all he had left, and though they hadn't spoken in years, he knew he had to find her. The thought of reconciling with his daughter was the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the weight of his despair. Using the last of his money, Leonard bought a bus ticket to the city where Mira lived. The journey was long and grueling, but as the bus rolled into the station, he felt a glimmer of hope. He clutched the scrap of paper with her address on it and made his way to her apartment building. When Mira opened the door, she froze. "Dad?" she said, her voice filled with a mix of shock and suspicion. Leonard nodded, his eyes welling with tears. "It's me, Mira. I needed to see you." Mira hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was small but cozy, filled with books and photographs that spoke of a life Leonard had never been a part of. "I don't understand," Mira said as she poured him a cup of tea. "Where have you been all this time? Why now?" Leonard took a deep breath and told her everything. The loss of Eleanor, the loneliness, the flyer that had led him to the Circle. He described the rituals, the locked door, the ascension, and his harrowing escape. Mira listened in stunned silence, her expression shifting between disbelief and concern. When he finished, she set her cup down and shook her head. "Dad, this sounds... I don't know what to say. Are you sure this really happened?" Leonard's heart sank. He had expected doubt, but hearing it from his own daughter cut deeper than he anticipated. "I know how it sounds," he said. "But it's real, Mira. I saw it. I lived it. And they're still out there." Mira placed a hand on his. "I believe that you believe it," she said gently. "But maybe it would help to talk to someone. A therapist, maybe." Leonard pulled his hand away, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think I'm crazy," he said bitterly. "You think I made it all up." "I didn't say that," Mira replied, her voice firm but calm. "But, Dad, you've been through so much. If there's even a chance that you're not well, don't you owe it to yourself to find out?" The conversation ended in strained silence. Leonard stayed with Mira for a few days, but the rift between them only grew. She was kind and patient, but her skepticism was a constant reminder of how isolated he had become. One evening, as Leonard sat alone in the apartment, he turned on the television to distract himself. The news was on, and a headline caught his attention. "Mysterious disappearances in rural communities." The reporter spoke of a pattern, people vanishing without a trace, always near isolated areas. Leonard's blood ran cold. He recognized the locations. They were all near places the Circle had mentioned in their teachings. He grabbed a notebook and began jotting down the details, cross-referencing them with what he remembered. The pattern was clear. The Circle was still operating, moving from place to place, leaving destruction in its wake. Determined to stop them, Leonard made a decision. He couldn't rely on the authorities or even Mira. He would have to confront the Circle himself. He spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies, and studying everything he could about cults and their methods. He knew it was dangerous, likely suicidal, but he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try. The night Leonard left Mira's apartment, he slipped a letter under her door. In it, he apologized for everything, for his absence, for his failures, for the burden he had placed on her. He didn't tell her where he was going, only that he loved her and hoped she would find happiness. Leonard's search led him to a remote town several hundred miles away, where reports of strange gatherings and unexplained disappearances had surfaced. He tracked the Circle to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The building loomed like a specter against the night sky, its windows dark and foreboding. As Leonard approached, he felt the familiar weight of fear pressing down on him. But this time, he didn't let it stop him. Clutching a small camera and a flashlight, he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. The faint sound of chanting echoed through the halls, drawing Leonard deeper into the factory. He moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness until he reached a large, open room. There, he saw them. The circle. Dozens of robed figures stood in a circle around a makeshift altar. At the center was Elias, his presence as commanding as ever. His voice carried through the room, a chilling blend of authority and reverence. Leonard raised his camera, snapping pictures as quickly and quietly as he could. He didn't know if the images would be enough to convince the world of the circle's existence, but it was a start. Suddenly, Elias stopped speaking. His head turned sharply, his eyes locking onto Leonard's hiding place. "We have a guest," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Panic surged through Leonard as the robed figures turned toward him. He bolted, his heart pounding as he navigated the labyrinthine factory. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Footsteps, shouts, the rustle of fabric. Leonard burst through a side door and into the cold night air. He didn't stop running until he reached the main road, where a passing car screeched to a halt to avoid hitting him. The driver got out, shouting angrily, but Leonard barely heard him. He had escaped, again. But he knew the circle wouldn't stop. They would keep moving, keep recruiting, keep destroying lives. As the car drove him back to town, Leonard stared out the window, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The fight wasn't over.